So first, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity for being up here, and thank you for coming. We got a lot of really cool material we're going to be covering this summer, and as I said, a lot of it, so we're just going to head and jump into it. So first, we're just going to cover a few Bible verses to set our minds for covering this kind of material. Usually when we cover this material, it's focused on apologetics, based upon the word apologia for defense. And while we'll be using some of these approaches, we're going to come at it a little bit differently. So I want you to write these verses down and go back and look at them in context. Unfortunately, because of time restraints, we're just going to be going 1, 2, 3 through these and so on, just to kind of set our minds, but please go back and look at them at your own time. So in 1 Peter 3, we know that everyone needs to be able to give an answer why we believe, a reasoning for it, and it needs to be a good reason. It can't just be, I believe because I believe. Jude 1:3, we need to contend for the faith. We need to make sure we're putting effort in this. This is not a passive thing. This is something that we need to be putting our energy into in our time. And then 2 Corinthians 10:5, we need to make sure that we have an answer to any argument against Christ. If there is a thought, if there's a philosophy that says God did not do this or God is not real and so on, we need to make sure that we have a reasoning for that, against that, I should say. And so we have the rationale mandates. Basically, we need to make sure we have a reason for why we believe, as those verses I just went over said. We also need to make sure that we're communicating in a way that is understandable. To the Jews, we need to be a Jew and so forth. And then, most importantly, we need to make sure that we are pointing to Christ. It does not matter if we can get somebody to believe everything in the Bible. If they don't believe in Christ, then it's all for naught. So whenever you're giving a defense for why you believe what you believe, make sure that you are pointing to Christ. When we need to be firm in the Lord, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and we will go into this verse in a little bit more detail later on. And we need to make sure that we're not ashamed of God's words. When it comes to a decision between who to trust, man's words or God's words, man's thoughts or God's thoughts, we need to make sure that we are firmly in the camp of God's thoughts on that. And last, we need to make sure that we stay rooted in Christ, built up in Him. If we try to approach some of these topics not being rooted and built up in Christ, we can definitely get lost or confused very easily. There's a lot of material. But why is this important? Unfortunately, a large number of people, as they get older, will leave the church. 87% of teenagers, once they're out on their own, will leave the church. Some of the reasons were for questioning the religious teachings, not liking the church's positions on social, political issues, the organization or the leaders there, and just the thought that religion is irrelevant to them. And put in their own words, I learned the truth about evolution when I went away to college. Religion is nothing but the opiate of the people. Rational thought makes religion go out the window. Or, I'm doing a lot more learning, studying, and kind of making decisions myself rather than listening to someone else. Some other statistics. In 1999, 70% of Americans attended a worship house of some sort. And that does not mean churches alone. That's also including synagogues and mosques. In 2018, only 50%. In 2020, 47%, the first time in 80 years that it dropped below 50%. And in 2022, one survey found that only 28% of Americans attended a worship service. Some of their reasons were learning about evolution when I went away to college, any sort of scientific or specific evidence of a creator, and so forth. Specifically of young people, 14 to 24, the reason why they believed in evolution over the Bible and the atheistic religion that is common in our society is the arguments for human evolution. Neo-Darwinisms, the thought of mutations, natural selections producing everything in our genome, fossils and so-called transition fossils, and the apparent consensus of scientists regarding evolution. We will be discussing these, but not in this class today. So how do we correct this? Well, first we need to make sure that we're teaching our children diligently. But how can we teach them a defense when we ourselves don't have the defense for them? So even if we don't need a defense against certain arguments, our children might. So we need to make sure that those who are entrusted in our care have those arguments, have those defenses. So we need to make sure we are seeking out ways and opportunities to learn, teaching and engaging, and actually going out and having conversations with people. So for this class, we're going to be focusing on two main purposes. The defense of our faith, building up our faith, being able to have a reason for what we believe and transferring that to our children, but also to reach out to others, acting like a bridge pointing to Christ. And the good thing is that the material we have is built up on the solid foundation of the Bible. That also means that everything in this class that we're going to be going over, if it doesn't have a book, chapter, or verse connected to it, it can change. So this is something that you will have to stay up with, unfortunately, or fortunately if you like that kind of thing. So it will take a lot of extra work on your guys' part as time goes forward. This is just to get things started. Unfortunately, the evolutionary worldview has become the default worldview. It is everywhere. Most people that produce media that we consume nowadays, and even in the last 200 years, has been from the point of view of an atheistic religion, has been of the point of view of an evolutionary worldview. Our novels, our movies, our games, even political commentary, because that is their worldview, that is how they see everything. That is how they interpret everything. And so when they give reasoning, when they give what they think is going to happen next, this is their reasoning for it. It can be something like this, where it is fun, where evolution is desirable, commonplace. Even though it's not the same term as we think of scientifically, it is still the term evolution, and it puts a good feeling, good thought in people's minds. They can actually target our children, teaching in the opening sequences evolutionary dogma. They put animals on the same level as humans. The theory of evolution can be integral to the plot, very open, very obvious. At other times, the theory of evolution is a bit more hidden, a bit more indirectly integral to the plot. And even whole genres are taken into this. You can't find a science fiction novel, movie, or book that doesn't have some thought or some approach to evolution or evolutionary ideas. And they can be quite subtle. In some episodes, you will see them act out the entire sequence of evolution without even using the term evolution or any words describing it. And in other times, they can be quite crude. So be wary of what you're taking in and how it might be influencing you and your children especially. And I'm not saying we can't watch these kind of things. I'm just saying we need to be aware of what we're taking in and hoping that you'll start seeing how you're being influenced. For example, here is an excerpt from a book about anesthesia and pain reduction in animals. So this is something that I have to read for my job. And in the opening preface, they wrote, "Humans have eschewed overt cruelty towards animals as far back as biblical times. Charles Darwin recognized that animals possess the fundamentals of consciousness. His reasoning was that if animals show emotion through behavioral expression, then the behavioral expression of emotion that in man must share a similar neurobiological evolution with the other animals capable of expressing similar emotions." Did you catch what they did there? They could have wrote in ancient times, thousands of years ago, prehistoric time, but no, they were connecting animal cruelty and the Bible. Perhaps they didn't intentionally mean to do that, but that's how they've connected it with that word there. Yet, what is it being referenced? In Deuteronomy 22, it actually says, "Don't take the young with the mother in the nest." Deuteronomy 25, "Do not muzzle the ox when it treads out the grain." And Numbers 22, Balaam is reprimanded for actually beating his donkey. And so we're taught how to be good stewards, not anything related to animal cruelty. So I don't know what they were referencing, but in their minds, in their worldview, the Bible and cruelty, especially animal cruelty, are connected. And then as far as the claim that Charles Darwin brought up animals to the level of human care, unfortunately that's maybe the case, but unfortunately for everyone, it's also the reverse, because he didn't bring animals up to human care in all ways. In fact, he's brought humans down to the level below animals. It didn't cause racism, but it was heavily influenced, or racism was heavily influenced by his ideas and fueled by them. And also another question, when you look at things evolutionarily, why is cruelty wrong? From an evolutionary worldview, why is cruelty wrong? That's supposed to be the drive to make things better. The suffering, the death is supposed to improve things. So think about that. We will go a little bit more in detail as we go forward. But from a Christian worldview, it's obvious. But from an evolutionary worldview, why is it wrong? So with this class, usually people will approach certain aspects of evolution, trying to weaken the evolutionary worldview placed in our minds by the media that we consume. We, either taught in school or simply by taking it in, have an idea of the evolutionary worldview. Now, I want you to think back 10,000 years ago. What do you picture? You should picture nothing. But according to the evolutionary worldview, you may have had thoughts of mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed tigers, and the Ice Age pop into your head. There are movies, there's media, even in our schools we're taught that, the building of the pyramids and the like. So most of the time with a class like this, we punch holes, defeating specific arguments, whether important or not, it doesn't matter, but we're still punching holes in the theory of evolution. But all that does is leave us with a weakened evolutionary worldview. It does not give us a strong biblical worldview about how all these things that are taught relate to the Bible and how the Bible relates to everything else. And so with time, simply because we're going to school or because we're taking in media, that weakened evolutionary worldview is filled back in. And so in this class, we're going to be focusing on building a biblical worldview. We're going to be taking the Bible as a whole and showing that everything in there is consistent with everything that we see. And so we will be focusing mainly on that with a minor focus on the evolutionary worldview and punching the holes in it. But our main focus is going to be on the biblical worldview.
I appreciate bringing up a couple times the idea of our media, movies, music, games, etc., having that influence. I hope as people read God's Word and as people come and see evidences, that they'll start to absorb the media around us. It's not that, well, you shouldn't watch it. You won't want to watch it.
Yeah.
It's full of falsehood.
Yeah, it's not fun being lied to. And that's what we're being done, intentionally or unintentionally, with a lot of this media. Yeah.
See those fun things, but in our hearts we'll decide, I don't even want that because it's taking me away from God.
Yeah. And so with this class, hopefully we'll get some of that mindset. Now, we will be having a buffet-style approach. I like that. Some people may like to go in more detail. Unfortunately, because of time restraints and the sheer amount of material that we're going to be covering over, we're going to be doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But these are things that I wish I knew going off into college and being in high school. And this is basically to get everyone a good starting point. So please take notes. Go back over this as it's posted back up on YouTube for on-demand viewing. Basically, you need to put some effort into this because we're going to be covering a lot of material very quickly. And last, we're going to be approaching this from the John 3:12 approach. If I had told you earthly things and you do not believe, then how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? By being confident that the Bible is accurate when it tells us these earthly things, then we can be confident that when it tells us spiritual things, that it is the truth. Any questions before we go on to the material? All right. Speaking of truth, that's where we're going to start. What is truth? What is truth?
God's Word is truth.
God's word's truth, yes. How do we know that?
He tells us in His Word.
He tells us in His Word, yeah. Any other comments?
17.
Say again?
John 17:17.
John 17:17, yeah. Any other comments? But how do you know something that is not directly in the Bible? How do you know if that's truth? How can you believe something is truth?
You see the proofs.
See the proofs, all right. And so sometimes it's easier to cut out what isn't truth. It's not our feelings, it's not because we have a belief or conviction in it, and thankfully not even the majority view. And unfortunately in our culture, we have a lot of things that are up front that they're going to lie to us. We can't trust ads, politicians, lawyers, filters on images. We can't even trust what we're seeing with our own eyes. Videos even with AI, audio recordings completely falsified. Media and fake news, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, etc. And that has led to the modern philosophy of postmodernism, that truth is not universal. We each have our own little truths. Societies construct their own truths, or that truth is just plain subjective. And if you talk to some people, they will hold this view. And on the surface, it seems kind of accurate. I mean, after all, there are different cultures, different religions, different beliefs, different governments. And how can we say that one is better than the other? The main problem with this is that if there is no overarching truth, how can that be an overarching truth? By saying that there is no overarching truth, That is a overarching truth in and of itself. It's a self-defeating philosophy. And that is just the simplest way to refute this. There are many other contradictions and assumptions, and the biggest problem with this point of view is that it sets people up for hopelessness. There's no purpose except to eat, drink, and be merry. And that leads to moral relativity. Unfortunately, we cannot get through life, through day-to-day things, without using overarching truths. We can't. We always have to put our trust in something, an overarching truth of the day, of the event, of just the world existing. And so people that take this view frequently only take it on things that are unimportant to them. So one thing to help get out of this view is realizing that you use it for things that you feel important, but you don't use it for things that you seem unimportant, that you don't want to put your time into. Another common view today is that truth is only in science. You can only find truth by studying it. You can only find truth by measuring it and looking at it. The problem is that truth from science? Is the truth that you can only find truth in science from science? No, science doesn't tell us that. And there's many other things, many other problems with this. And unfortunately, it again falls flat, but you will come across this day to day. So what?
A lot of times we get the criticism, well, when you say the Bible is truth and you back that up with a quote from the Bible, that's circular reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're seeing the same thing with the idea that science is the only source of truth. Well, where would you find that? Well, we're going to use science to back it up. So when we get to big picture ideas of what substantiates truth, it's hard to escape circular reasoning when you limit the source of truth to a certain origin.
Mm-hmm. It is a lot of circular reasoning that is argued for. And people do claim the Bible the same thing. And we'll be going into the reason why that's not the case here in just a few moments. But in short, trying to figure out truth is that which corresponds to reality. And in the philosophical approaches, there are two main ways, perhaps there are others, but two that I have come across. One, the law of non-contradiction. So that is two opposite statements cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. A sign cannot be both blue and red, completely blue and red at the same time in the same sense. Even if somebody is colorblind, that sign is still red, even though they cannot perceive it. So irregardless of if you can access that knowledge or not, it is still a truthful statement. Then there is the law of coherence. Truth is that which is internally consistent or bound together. So basically, true in and of itself cannot be self-refuted. So for example, all married men are husbands. That is a truthful statement. Yet, if you Thanos snap all the married men out of existence, then that statement becomes empty. It is no longer a description of truth. And so it has to be consistent and logical in and of itself. But how do we know that a statement of truth is connected to reality, that it is according and corresponds to the facts? What are some ways that you can know something? What are ways that you learn? Repeatability, yeah. And that goes with usually measuring things in the scientific process. Any other processes? Any other methods? Observation, yeah. You can experience it yourself. Any others? All right. There are a few others, and we'll go into them. But those are the main two that we use today. Those are the main two that we were taught. Our society is a very scientifically focused society. If you can't see it, measure it, then it doesn't matter. But these are the main ones. We have the empirical, the measuring one. We have the experiential one, where we see it and go through it ourselves. But we also have the logical one, the reasoning things out. That's one that unfortunately isn't taught that often in this day and age, but is more of a philosophical approach. So we are going to answer the question, is such and such an item hot? So if we want to use the empirical approach, what's one way that we can determine if an item is hot? By measuring it. How can you measure if something is hot? Thermometer. Yep. A thermometer can tell us. Now, how can we reason if something is hot? Say we can't see the item. How can we reason that it's hot? Well, go ahead. If it comes from a hot water heater, thank you. Yeah, and so we can determine based upon where it's at and where it's coming from if it's hot. Say if it's a sunny summer day at noon and the object's outside. we can reason that an object will be hot. Or we can touch it. I would not recommend doing that with the stove. So be careful. But can those observations, can those ways of knowing things be wrong? Can we be wrong in that determination? And one way of approaching this is by asking, do we know all the information in the world? All the information in the universe, do we know that? Do we know everything? Do we know half of the things? Do we know anything at all as far as the world, the universe goes? Not much. We know less than 1%, basically. We know next to nothing. And so if there is something unknown, can it change these statements? These statements of truth that the thermometer told us, or that we can reason it out, or by touching an object even, can those be wrong? Can that no longer be truth? So the thermometer itself cannot be calibrated, or maybe you read Celsius as Fahrenheit, or vice versa. Maybe the object is actually in the shade, not actually in the sun, but it's a sunny outside, a day outside. Now, how can touching something be wrong? You're touching something and it feels hot. Can that be wrong? Actually, yeah. In our skin, we have both hot and cold receptors. And if we expect something to be very hot to the touch, and we touch it, it's going to activate the cold receptors. Now, if we touch something that's icy cold, it's just going to activate those cold receptors. But you're still going to think it's hot right away, so you're going to instinctively pull your hand back before you get the full understanding of the object. I wouldn't recommend attempting this because you could inadvertently get yourself burned by trying that, but I'm sure some of us have reached the sink expecting it to be hot water, but really it's icy cold, and we instinctively pull back. So there is always, almost, information that will prove what we think we know wrong. So how can we know truth? How can we know truth? Well, one way is by trying to combine those three ways. That gives us a good idea because it's hard to prove all three ways wrong. Yet, two of those ways, the reasoning ability, the laws of reason, and also the consistency of empirical measurements require some authority. It does require an earthly authority, making sure we're all using the same units and same understanding of what can and cannot be proven. But it also requires a divine authority, a design authority, a creator authority, because if the laws of reason are not consistent, or if things change from time to time or day to day in an illogical manner, such as God not upholding the world, the universe, then how can we trust those? That then turns it into purely experiential knowledge. And experiential knowledge by itself, just as we saw, can be falsified. And that turns everything into the relativity of thought, the relativity of truth, which many have fallen into, as we've just seen. And there's one other way that we can know something, and that's by being taught by someone who knows. Yet if we're being taught by a person, they fall into the same problems, the same pitfalls that we run into when trying to learn something. So how do we know? How do we know if a teacher knows that? Well, they have to claim they know. They also have to claim they know everything. And they have to be right in everything that they have told us. So we need to make sure that we're testing. Thankfully, we have someone who says that they know, who says that they know everything, and who we can test. And that is by going over the Bible. And that's what we're going to be doing in this class, to make sure that we can have a faith in truth. Now, because of our limited knowledge in testing things, we cannot prove something beyond any doubt. You will not be able to prove God beyond any doubt. That is an impossibility. So you will not find in this class or anywhere any argument, any understanding or philosophy in which you can prove God beyond any doubt to anybody. You're not going to find a silver bullet. But we can prove God beyond a reasonable doubt many, many, many times. You will find many of these arguments here. And that is the ideal standard for which we base our society on, is beyond a reasonable doubt. And so keep that in mind as we go forward, that the only way we can know truth, because everything on our own understanding is subject to be altered, because we don't know nearly everything. We don't know hardly anything. Yet God, who does, has told us. And that is the only way in which we can know truth. So keep that in mind as we go forward. And I do think that that is the reason why we're told the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Because without fearing, without trusting God, we can know nothing. We can be confident in nothing that we know. Any questions on that before we go to philosophical approaches otherwise?
1 Thessalonians 5:21 says, test all things, hold fast to what's good. You talked about testing. Really, that testing is what builds our trust. It's what builds our faith.
Yeah, if God says he knows everything and knows what we need to know, if we don't test it, then how can we know that those statements are true? And by testing everything that he tells us, even though we cannot come to an answer on some of those things, if we find one wrong answer, that negates everything. And we haven't. There is no one time that God was wrong, and we can have that trust in that.
I like when old preacher said one time, he says, it's not so much what you're taught, it's what's caught.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you fall under influence, perhaps of some things over and over, you tend to pick it up.
Yeah.
In your mind.
And that's part of the problem with this society that we live in, is that it's everywhere. Yeah.
These biblical invitations also don't condemn doubt.
No.
That's not something you should fear.
No, yeah, definitely don't fear doubt. You cannot get rid of every doubt. You can get rid of the reasonable doubts, though. And that's one thing that you can only find by testing and by pursuing this. This is not a blind pursuit. This is a eyes wide open pursuit. Any other comments before we go on?
I converse with a number of atheists, and when you say prove, like we have certain, let's just say scientific ways, I guess, in our culture, society,
Mm-hmm.
that we accept as proof. And when you say you cannot prove God, which I agree, which I agree. Are you talking as in, let's just say, prove to another person, or prove for ourselves?
Both. Yeah. This class, we're definitely going to be building up ourselves, and then by building up ourselves, we can then go and build up other people. Yeah, so this is something that we want to make sure we're taking in internally, but if we're not using it, we're not getting the full benefit of this. Yeah. All right. So now to some philosophical and logical arguments. So this is basically the basics of the basics. This does not require any scientific understanding. This does not require any empirical testing. This is basically using reason alone. And the main problem with a lot of these is it does not point to the God of the Bible. It just points to an all-powerful, potentially creator deity of some kind, leading you to the belief of theism. But it is one step closer to God of the Bible. The first argument is the cosmological argument. How many have heard of this before? I've seen a few hands. In short, it's the argument of an origin. It goes, every contingent thing, meaning a non-eternal thing, needs a cause for its existence. The universe is not eternal. Therefore, the universe must have a cause, and the cause of the universe cannot be within itself. A thing cannot cause itself. And so it must exist outside space, time, and matter, the basic building blocks of the universe. And that points to a spaceless, timeless, immaterial cause of the entire universe, very consistent with the biblical concept, what's in the Bible. But this approach does have a few pitfalls, mainly the target audience. We are not taught a lot of this. We're not taught philosophical approaches. We are not a philosophical society. And some may say things just happened. Some may say that science will eventually explain it. Or, if you're like me and dislike physics, they'll take you off into the realm of physics and theoretical physics. That's what I meant to say. And that is a lot of material. So now you have to know both the philosophical material approach and the theoretical physics approach. And that's a lot of material and a lot of weeds to get through. And so it's very useful in certain situations. And I would encourage you to look a little bit more into this because, like I said, this is just a bare bones kind of approach, a basic definition. There is a lot of material on this, thousands of years worth. Any questions on that? All right. Next is the ontological argument. How many have heard of this one? All right. In short, that's the being argument. And there are many, many approaches, some better, some worse. The original one has not been disproven with any certainty, but we'll be going over the modern argument simply because it is phrased and used in such a way that seems to be better able to be understood by us today. And that is, is it possible that a maximally great being exists? And by that, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-being, all-good, all-powerful, best of the best, good, better in every way. Is that possible? Is that logically non-contradictory? Is that true in of itself? If that is true in of itself, That means in some possible world, some possible scenario, and I don't mean multiverse theory or anything like that. I mean scenario, possibility, ABC kind of occurrence. Is that possible in some way? Most people today will have to say yes because we don't know everything, so we cannot exclude that. It's not illogical in of itself, so we must go on. So if a maximally great being exists in some world of possibility, then one that exists in all worlds or possibilities is greater. Therefore, a maximally great being must exist in all worlds, possibilities, scenarios, including the one in which we're in. This is a very in-depth argument, a very confusing argument. And the first time I heard it, as I'm sure many of you are thinking right now, this sounds like nonsense. It's not. It just goes against the grain of what we're usually taught and how we're taught to think. So I would encourage you to read a lot more into this. But here are some critiques, and you may have already thought of some of them. Some try to replace a different object with God in this argument. Some will use an island. Since they can't refute the argument, they just say that argument applies to many, many things, so it can't prove God because it can prove anything. We know those things don't exist. So they're replaced with an island. But an island, and almost every other object that you replace this with, is subject to other forces and objects. An island, for example, has erosion, has the tides, has volcanisms. All these things affect it. So it can't be maximally great in that sense. And the other thing is we don't really have a method to measure maximally great. Is a maximally great island one with no sand or all sand, or somewhere in between? What about fish? Big fish, little fish, most one kind of fish, tasty fish, pretty fish? Fruit, multiple fruit, one kind of fruit, fruit of every season. What is a maximally great island? Everyone has a different idea of this. It's pure opinion. So then they'll say, okay, let's look at one specific person. What is your idea of a maximally great island? Well, the problem with this is an island that has everything that we could need is going to be better than an island that only has some of the things we need. An island with a hotel that's free, that has wonderful beds to sleep in, is going to be better than an island without. An island that can predict what you need is going to be better than an island that can't. An island that can talk to you and commune with you and have a relationship with you is going to be better than an island that can't. Eventually, you're going to be arguing your way up to God. And so, basically, this critique doesn't work. Some other arguments against it try to make the idea of an all-powerful being illogical. So they will attack omniscience. Is being all-knowing illogical? Saying that God can't know what it's like being a human separate from God, because he's God and not separate from himself. And on the surface, it kind of makes sense, but let's dig a little bit deeper. God knows our minds. If we know something, we know what it's like to not be God, to be separate from God, and God knows everything. Therefore, God must know our minds. It does not make omniscience all-knowing illogical. It just describes the relationship that God has with the non-God, us. So then they'll try to attack omnipotence, and they'll give what's called the paradox of the stone. So can God make an unliftable stone? Because if he can't, then he's not all-powerful. But if he can't lift it, then he's not all-powerful. So they're saying that being all-powerful is illogical. Yet, the problem is that being all-powerful does not give you the ability to make anything regardless of logical coherence. You cannot make something illogical. You cannot make a cubed sphere. Those two things are self-contradictory. It's basically saying that, can you scroll up on my notes a little bit? Thank you. So the assumption is in the problem itself. Assuming that all-powerfulness can make something illogical is the problem with this critique. And again, going into this, there's a lot more detail. This is just a bare bones kind of approach. But do you have any questions about those? Is your mind swimming? I hope not. If so, you can always come talk to me later. All right. But similarly to the cosmological argument, the two biggest problems today is the lack of ability to understand this. We're not trained in this. We cannot think this way, or we're not taught to think this way. It takes a lot of effort on our part to think this way. And this particular argument has been around for over 1,000 years. There's a lot of material on it. And you have to go through all that material because they've been discussing it, they've been debating it, they've been trying to refine it, different ways that work and don't. And so there is a lot of material on this. And if you're trying to bring somebody up to that speed, it's very easy for them to say, this is just nonsense, I don't want to deal with it. This makes my brain hurt, stop. That being said, It has been used to teach 8 to 10-year-olds. And one of those kids actually took this material home and helped bring his dad to Christ with it. It can be useful. It can be good. So if you want to know more, William Lay Craig has a YouTube series that he goes over this argument. And that is basically what we're doing here, except the entire class is pointed towards this argument. So if you want more information, look him up. He has some good material on this. Any questions before we go on to the next one? All right. Next, we're going to be going to the moral argument. Has anyone heard this before? All right, a bit more hands. All right. So this is basically a two-part argument. One says that all people and cultures have an idea of right and wrong. They have knowledge of good and evil. And certain things are good and evil consistent among these cultures. Not all, not even most, but some. But the important thing with this one is that all have the idea of good and evil. And so there are moral laws and conventions in human culture. Is that because of the society? Is that because of the government? Or is it because of God? So we can know for sure that there are moral truths that transcend all people. There are things that are good in all cultures, things that are bad. But it's not everything. In some cultures, stealing is a good thing, because if you're stealing to support yourself and your family, it is my moral duty to take advantage of you if you give me that opportunity, because I'm taking care of me and myself and my family. Not all cultures have that. But still, the idea of taking care of your family is a good idea. It's thought of as good, even though they're doing it the wrong way. Is the concept of good and evil transcendent among people? All societies and cultures have an idea of good and evil. And so if it transcends all people, then it must precede us. It must be beyond us. It must be something that's not in our control. So how did these moral truths occur? Some great apologetics that promote this. Frank Turek, he does a lot of this with his one-on-one discussions with people, and even C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity does touch on this. And it is a good approach because a lot of the problems that people have with God are not based upon the evidence. They're based upon their thoughts of what is good and evil. It's because not that God can exist, but because if God exists, he's mean, he's wrong, he's bad. And so this is a great approach for those things when the root of the problem is a heart problem, not a brain problem. If a person is an atheist, if they don't believe in God, that means that there must either be an evolutionary drive for morals or a cultural society drive, because that is the only way that you can have an idea of good and evil or know where morals come from. And I'm not saying that if you don't believe in God, you can't be moral, only that by doing so, you're relying on hypocrisy because you're relying on a worldview for your morals. If this is a cultural product, that means people in a different culture don't have to follow your morals. And this was actually argued at the Nuremberg trials when the Nazis were put under trial for this. They actually argued for this, that because you are a different culture, you cannot say what my culture says is good is bad. But because of the transcendent moral law, argued by Justice Robert Jackson, we know the truth in that. So if you think that this is a cultural product, you have to say that the Nazis did nothing bad. The second is the evolutionary product. It has many of the same pitfalls because if you're not in the same evolutionary branch, if you're of a different lineage, you cannot say that my morals are worse than your morals, that what I think is good is only good to me, and what you think is only good to you, and I can't complain if you do something I think is bad. But it also requires a genetic component. That genetic component has to be so good that it outcompeted everything else in the human line as far as that goes. That is why because we don't see any humans today that have no moral law. Yet we see animals everywhere. Every single animal does not have the moral law, does not have an idea of good and evil. And so that does push to the limits and beyond the limits of understanding of logic, because there is nothing that is that good that will push out all the others that don't believe in the moral law. In fact, you'd think the reverse. If you have a people group that believe in morals and a people group that doesn't, you think the one that doesn't have any morals would just attack and kill all the other ones for competition. But oddly enough, it's the one with morals that is all we see. And so it is kind of contradictory. Oh, any questions on the moral law before we go on to a few other minor approaches? No? Okay. So the same thing is for many other things that we deal with day to day, the non-material concepts. Free will, for one. If our brains are nothing more than chemical reactions in a physical medium, that means that all they're doing is reacting and responding to natural forces. Therefore, we can have no free will. The second is logic. If our brains are the result of millions of years of random accumulation of mistakes, why would we trust it to reason correctly? You wouldn't trust your calculator to do that, let alone your phone. And last is the very consistency of natural laws. If you're an atheist and you say, we know that the laws are consistent because they have always been consistent, that's a very large assumption. We have many things that change randomly, and then we try to figure out why. Why would natural laws be any differently unless you have a belief in a creator that upholds the universe? And this is the very reason why science truly blossomed only in nations that followed God, followed Christianity, because we had that trust, we had that faith. Such things are not only strongly supported, but are expected underneath the Christian worldview, but do put a heavy burden on any atheistic or evolutionary worldview. Overall, with philosophy, the main problems are a lot of material, and we just aren't trained in it. You have a lot of work if you want to learn this, and you have a lot of work if you want to use this to reach out to people. But it can be done, and this is a lot of good material. This is commonly used by old Earth evolutionists or old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists, those that don't have any of the other natural sciences to lean on. Because they don't have anything else to support the Bible, this is all they have. So they have worked it out in remarkable detail. So be careful when you follow somebody that does follow these and promote these kind of arguments, because they may have a few things that are false because of their assumptions and because of giving in to man's word. The other problem is that these don't point to Christ or even the Father. They point to theism, the idea that there is a God. They don't point to God of the Bible. And so all arguments should lead to Christ. And that's not saying that these arguments can't be used, but you have more steps. And we need to make sure that we're using the fewest amount of steps to bring somebody from where they are to Christ, to bring ourselves from where we are to Christ. Otherwise, we have a greater chance of being lost in the weeds. And then just a brief note on miracles, because this is a big problem for a lot of people today. So what is a miracle? It's a special act of God that interrupts the normal course of events. I like to use the description that it's when somebody outside the box reaches into the box. Atheists believe that the box is closed. You can't reach in because there's nothing on the outside. Basically, God uses them to put his seal of approval on a message from him, so we know what words come from God, because only somebody outside can do it. And in short, if God exists, then miracles are possible. And if miracles are possible, then God exists. It defeats the other two main views of pantheism and atheism by this alone. And so that is one reason why people have such a hard time with it. Some will try to argue that because the natural laws are immutable and miracles negate natural laws, therefore miracles can't occur. Or they will assume that miracles can occur. And so any story, any narrative, anybody that says that miracle happened has to be wrong because miracles can't occur. It's a heavy reliance on circular reasoning. C.S. Lewis does have a book called Miracles that he goes into that a little bit more. But in short, science can't forbid miracles or resurrection. Science is the study on natural regularities of nature. I used nature twice, sorry. And so we know that dead bodies cannot rise. That is a law of nature. So we know when that happens, something very special did happen. But the reason why miracles are not susceptible, not underneath the laws of nature, is because they are supernatural. They are outside nature. They are above nature. They are not under their laws. If we, being natural, are under the laws of nature, somebody from a different country, for example, if we use that analogy, isn't under our laws. They're from somewhere else. And so we can trust that just because a miracle is reported to happen doesn't mean that it's false. And the thought and focus and belief in miracles is not a weakness. Science cannot disprove it, that miracles exist or don't exist. They can't do anything with that because science does not do anything with anything supernatural. It is natural science. So for the remainder of our study, we're going to start with knowledge, wisdom, and truth. Look into those verses. We already went over those a little bit. And then testing them, Acts 17, 1 Thessalonians 5, and 1 John 4. And using the methods given in John 3:12 and Mark 2, by examining the earthly things, we can have confidence in the heavenly things. And while I'd love to go into the revelation, bibliology, and basically the study of what Scripture is, that's a whole other class in and of itself. So we will be touching on those, but unfortunately, not in depth. So in summary, apologetics are necessary for everybody. This class is just going to be the starting point. I encourage you to continue. And that truth is not subjective. We went over the logic alone argument, the beginning argument, the right and wrong argument, and then free will, reason, and consistency all point to God. The dependence on miracles being fact is not a weakness. And please remember that all defenses should quickly point to Christ. As far as resources, I'd encourage you to write those down if you wanted to learn more about these. I will try to have a list of resources with every class. And if you have any questions, feel free to come up and talk with me. I love to talk about this stuff. I got a lot more material than what we went over, so there is a lot out there. But as you go forward, go over the class again as it's posted on YouTube, make your notes. Anything else before we finish? All right, thank you very much.